Hi folks, today's video will be about how the Young Turks mischaracterize the filibuster, and how they're hypocritical about it. Of course, they're not embarrassed by hypocrisy, and even if they did understand it, it wouldn't matter. These people oppose anything that gets in the way of them having power, and we should all hope that the likes of these never get power, because their ideas are terrible and history proves that. But just in case they do, you should be prepared. Friends, the time to prepare for bad times is during good times. If you know a big storm is coming, you prepare in advance. Same goes for our nation's future. Things seem calm right now, so it's the perfect time to prepare for the next big crisis. That's why we recommend stocking up on emergency food from Patriot Supply. They're America's #1 preparedness company, with millions of happy, well-prepared customers. Their food lasts up to 25 years in storage. It's an insurance policy you can eat. When you need it, it will be there. And right now, you can save $50 on a 4-week emergency food kit. The kit provides breakfast, lunch, dinner, drinks, and snacks, totaling over 2,000 calories a day. Every family in America should have one of these. So go to preparewithsteven.com and save $50 on your 4-week food kit. That's preparewithsteven.com. Steven with a PH. Do it before the peanut butter hits the fan. Go to preparewithsteven.com. Hi everyone. Today
The needs of the people are being sacrificed at the altar of the filibuster.
The filibuster is one of the more infamous political traditions in the United States. The Senate practice was mythologized in the 1939 film Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, wherein the story climaxed with Junior Senator Jefferson Smith, played by Jimmy Stewart, delivering a 24-hour barn burner of a speech on the Senate floor, pleading his innocence of corruption charges, until he collapsed from pure exhaustion. While romanticized, this portrayal has some truth in it. Filibusters actually used to involve senators speaking on the floor of the chamber. The longest ever filibuster in American history was by Democratic Senator of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond. In 1957, Thurmond spoke for just over 24 hours, doing his best to block civil rights legislation that was to be voted upon. As well as being the longest, this is the most famous filibuster in the history of the American Senate. And it was not the last time that Strom Thurmond would use this parliamentary tactic to try and block civil rights legislation. In 1964, Thurmond and other Southern senators used the filibuster and other tactics to stall civil rights legislation that was proposed that year. This is something that the folks over at the Young Turks love to remind us of whenever the topic of the filibuster comes up.
And let's not forget that the original point of the filibuster was to block civil rights. That was what it was used for exclusively. And not just, hey, civil rights as it is today, which is already massively important, but they literally blocked anti-lynching laws. It was used for pro-lynching. No, there is no great tradition of the filibuster. It was never a great tradition. It was always toxic. It was always terrible. And it was always meant to take away power from the people who needed it most.
If we don't figure out a way to overcome this extremely ancient rule that has only been utilized to target and stop the progress of historically disenfranchised people, we will continue to see policy unmet with the agenda that we push.
In the history of the filibuster, as we know, and if you don't know, I'm glad you asked me, is really rooted in racism. The most fiercest time that the filibuster have been used throughout the history of this country has been to stop some type of civil rights linked to racial equality. That is the tool of the filibuster, and it has been used that way ever since.
Are they correct? Is the filibuster an inherently racist institution that has been traditionally used as a tool to continue to disenfranchise historically marginalized people? Was the filibuster originally crafted to prevent civil rights legislation? Well, this might surprise you, but no, the origins of the filibuster have nothing to do with racism or opposing civil rights. That is, unless you're one of these 1619 Project people who thinks that everything having to do with the United States is inherently racist because slavery was a part of the United States' founding. For the record, I am not one of those people, in case you didn't know. The filibuster was actually started inadvertently by Aaron Burr, former vice president and president of the Senate, who is probably most famous for having shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel. We need only look at Wikipedia for this information. Originally, the possibility to filibuster was accidentally introduced as a side effect of an 1806 rule change which eliminated the ability to end debate in the Senate by a simple majority rule. Thus, the minority could extend debate on a bill indefinitely by holding the floor of the Senate, preventing the bill from coming to a vote. Now, it is absolutely true that the filibuster was used to promote racist ends. Not only was it used to block civil rights legislation in the 20th century, in the antebellum era, John C. Calhoun used it to project Southern and therefore slaveholding power. This in and of itself does not prove that the filibuster is some inherently racist institution, however. The filibuster can and has been used for other purposes, including purposes that progressives approve of. The second longest filibuster in the history of the Senate was by Louisiana Democrat Huey Long in 1935. Long was originally a supporter of FDR and the New Deal, but he had soured on both as he didn't view them as radical enough. He had actually planned to mount a 1936 presidential bid against FDR, which obviously failed to materialize after Long was assassinated. It's extremely difficult to run for and win public office when you're dead, though amazingly enough, not impossible. Because FDR viewed Long as a political opponent, Roosevelt sought to strengthen Long's opponents in Louisiana through patronage. This is what Long filibustered. As Andrew Glass wrote in Politico, Long, who was at odds with President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, ended his longest filibuster on June 13th in 1935. His goal had been to require Senate confirmation of the National Recovery Administration's senior employees. His underlying aim was to prevent his political enemies in Louisiana from obtaining cushy NRA jobs. More recently, the online left's favorite politician, Bernie Sanders, conducted a filibuster of his own. In 2010, the Vermont senator gave what became known as the speech among his supporters, where he excoriated Democrats and Republicans for allowing the extension of the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. Sanders later published a book that was just a transcript of his filibuster. This got him an invite onto The Daily Show, which no doubt raised his profile. This wasn't the first time I had heard of Sanders, but it was the first time I had been exposed to him in a real way. And I wasn't the only one. As Scott Detrow wrote at NPR, that's when Democrats really began to take notice. The calls to offices, after a couple of hours of the speech, they couldn't get in. Then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid said earlier in 2019. The Senate website was also briefly overwhelmed by traffic. And at a time when the feat was more of a political novelty, Sanders trended on Twitter and added scores of new followers. As Bernie's 2016 campaign manager, Jeff Weaver, told NPR, "When you look back at that, I think it might have been the spark that set things off. The filibuster brought Bernie Sanders to the notice of millions of Americans who didn't know who he was. And I think it laid a lot of the groundwork for the success that we would see in the 2015-2016 election cycle." Even more recently, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul filibustered for 10.5 hours, criticizing, among other things, the expansion of U.S. domestic surveillance programs since 9/11, and more specifically, the Obama-era policy of drone strikes on American citizens deemed to be terrorists. At the time, Cenk Uygur himself praised Paul.
You know we're on the right side when the Republican and the Democratic establishment are opposed to us. So the Wall Street Journal, of course, their editorial side is tremendously conservative, or they claim to be conservative. Really, they're corporatists. They love all the multinational corporations and protect them, and the establishment. So in this case, they're like, executing U.S. citizens. Of course, it's pro-establishment. We love it. How dare you, Rand Paul?
It's funny that Cenk, of all people, opposes the filibuster. If you remember back from his failed congressional run, Cenk's big plan for when he got into Congress was to make a bunch of heroic speeches on the floor of Congress, calling out the donors of the other politicians.
Of course, I wish I had won, right? Because we had this great plan that if I won, we'd make those speeches on the floor of the House, we'd get the spotlight, focus it on money in politics, focus it on the corruption, all these wonderful things that we wanted to do that now we won't be able to do.
That was his secret plan to move the needle in the progressive direction. Now, I'll grant you that most filibusters are no longer talking filibusters, but you'd think that Cenk would oppose ending the opportunity for politicians to get their word out directly to the public, as senators have done in the past, but I guess not. Now, let's revisit this fallacy that because the filibuster was used to prevent civil rights legislation, that it's an inherently racist institution. Imagine having this standard for other things. Do you know what was also a racist institution during the Civil Rights era? The Democratic Party. Strom Thurmond, the senator who I mentioned earlier, who holds the record for the longest filibuster when he was attempting to block the 1957 Civil Rights Act, was a Democrat. During this record-breaking filibuster, Thurmond took 2 quick breaks. That should have ended the whole thing, given that he was technically giving up the floor. However, the Senate Majority Leader looked the other way. Who was the Senate Majority Leader in 1957? Texas Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson. He allowed Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, who, ironically enough, Johnson would face off against in the 1964 presidential election, to take the floor briefly while Thurmond went to the bathroom. Johnson also gave Thurmond a break by carrying out some routine Senate business, including swearing in a new senator. Lyndon Johnson is usually heralded by progressives for his domestic agenda during his presidency, including the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. While most of the online left, including the folks over at TYT, keep the Democratic Party at arm's length, they tend to view the GOP as the racist party. Funny how things change. And don't forget, according to Cenk, the party switched.
I know it's hard for you to understand.
Yeah.
The party switched.
That is an oversimplification, to say the least. But the point is, just because an institution was racist at one point, doesn't make it so today. That or Cenk attempted to join a racist party when he ran for Congress. It's funny because TYT contributor Nina Turner mentions a certain piece of legislation that the Senate could have passed were it not for the filibuster.
But let's get back to this filibuster, which is really impacting every other thing. So whether it's, the $15 an hour minimum wage.
I'm honestly surprised she's still on $15 an hour. A lot of the online left has increased that number, as many of us predicted they would. Regardless, they all want employers to pay what they deem to be a living wage. This is ironic, because take a wild guess what has a racist past. The minimum wage. You see, one of the problems with setting an artificially high price floor for labor is that it prices certain people out of the labor market. Early progressive reformers knew this, and they implemented higher minimum wages precisely to keep people of color out of certain jobs. The Davis-Bacon Act of 1931 set the standard for contract negotiations on federal work projects. That included provisions that mandated that the federal government pay only prevailing wages to contractors. Negotiations on federal contracts is still a tactic used by Democrats to try and raise the wage floor. That said, according to the National Center for Policy Analysis, the Davis-Bacon Act requiring prevailing wages on federally assisted construction projects was supported by the idea that it could keep contractors from using cheap colored labor to underbid contractors using white labor. The United States is hardly unique in this regard. As Thomas Sowell pointed out, the same exact thing happens throughout the world. In 1925, a minimum wage law was passed in the Canadian province of British Columbia with the intent and effect of pricing Japanese immigrants out of jobs in the lumbering industry. A Harvard professor of that era referred approvingly to Australia's minimum wage law as a means to protect the white Australians' standard of living from the invidious competition of the colored races, particularly of the Chinese, who were willing to work for less. In South Africa, during the era of apartheid, white labor unions urged that a minimum wage law be applied to all races to keep black workers from taking jobs away from white unionized workers by working for less than the pay scale. This is still happening in South Africa, a country that is plagued by chronic unemployment. I would argue that minimum wage laws still disproportionately hurt people of color, as people of color are disproportionately low-skilled workers. That said, I would never suggest that this makes current proponents of a living wage racist for supporting it, or that it therefore makes a government-imposed wage floor inherently racist. That would be a ridiculous argument. Don't get me wrong, I think that the minimum wage is a bad policy in general, but its dark history and its lopsided consequences are immaterial to that critique, at least from a standpoint of economics. Arguing that way would be completely disingenuous. Of course, employing that exact same line of reasoning is not only what Cenk and company do when making their arguments against the filibuster, it's their go-to move. Of course, what are the Young Turks if not disingenuous?